He came home early on a Thursday afternoon in March, and he was not alone. Ronan Whitfield heard the front door open at 2:14 in the afternoon. He knew the time because he had been sitting at the kitchen island with a cup of tea gone cold, going over the production notes his assistant had sent that morning. He was not supposed to be home. His wife, Sylvie Whitfield, was not supposed to have company. But there were two sets of footsteps in the entryway. One was hers. The other was lighter, quicker, the sound of someone trying not to be heard. Ronan did not move. He sat very still with his hands around the cold mug, and listened to the low murmur of voices down the hall. A woman's laugh, soft and almost careful, like she already knew the shape of a room she had never been in before. Then Sylvie's voice, quieter, closer to a whisper. Something inside him had already understood before his mind caught up. He set the mug down without a sound. He walked toward the hallway with the same steadiness he brought to every difficult meeting, every quarterly review, every conversation where the numbers were bad, and the people across the table were watching to see if he would flinch. Sylvie was standing near the bottom of the stairs. Beside her stood a woman Ronan did not recognize. Late 30s, professionally dressed, a leather bag over one shoulder. They had not heard him coming. Sylvie's hand was resting lightly on the woman's arm, and the look on her face was not the look she gave to colleagues or old friends. It was the look she had once given to him. Sylvie turned, the color left her face immediately. "Ronan," she said. He looked at her. Then at the woman beside her. He did not raise his voice. He did not ask the question he already knew the answer to. There was nothing to ask. The answer was standing in his front hallway with a leather bag and borrowed confidence, and his wife's hand had been resting on her arm like muscle memory. He said quietly, "I need a few minutes." He turned and went upstairs. Behind him he heard Sylvie say something low and urgent to the woman. He did not stop to listen. In the bedroom, Ronan went to the closet. He pulled out the large gray duffel bag he used for travel and set it on the bed. He began removing things from the shelves with the same methodical attention he had given to cold tea and production notes 20 minutes earlier. Shirts folded, trousers rolled, his toiletry bag from the bathroom shelf, his passport from the drawer of the nightstand. His hands did not shake. He heard Sylvie come up the stairs. She stopped in the doorway of their bedroom. "Please," she said, "let me explain." He placed a folded shirt into the bag. "Sylvie," he said without looking up, "there's nothing to explain. That's not fair." He stopped. He looked at her. She was leaning against the door frame with her arms crossed, and he could see in her face the particular way she had of waiting for him to be reasonable, to be measured, to give her the version of himself she could argue with. He was too tired to give her that. "What would you like me to say?" he asked. She looked away. Her jaw tightened. "You're not even going to ask why?" "No." She said his name again, differently this time, softer, and for a moment he let himself feel the weight of what that name had once meant between them. 12 years, 2 cities, the apartment on St. Denis where the ceiling leaked every spring, and they had laughed about it instead of calling the landlord. The early years when they had nothing but ambition, and a shared list of the things they were going to build. He zipped the bag closed. Sylvie pushed off the door frame and stepped into the room. "I know how this looks," she said. "But you haven't been here, Ronan. You haven't been here in a long time." He picked up the duffel and looked at her. "I've been here every night for 3 years, he said. "That's not what I mean." "I know what you mean." He moved past her toward the door. She did not stop him. At the top of the stairs he paused. Not because he was about to change his mind. Because there was something he needed to say and he was not going to say it with his back to her. He turned. "You weren't wrong that I changed," he said. He kept his voice even. "But changing is not the same thing as leaving. You could have said something to me. You could have told me what you needed. I would have listened." He looked at her steadily. "You chose not to. You made this choice without me." Sylvie's eyes filled. He looked at her for one last moment. Then he went downstairs. The woman with the leather bag was gone. The front door was closed. The house felt very still in the way that houses do when something irreversible has just happened inside them. Ronan walked through the front door and did not look back. 14 years earlier, Ronan Whitfield had been 29 years old, and profoundly broke in a way that did not yet frighten him. Because he still believed it was temporary. He had a production company in name only. A numbered corporation, a second-hand editing suite in a walk-up on Sherbrooke, and a list of project ideas he kept in a battered notebook that had survived 3 in one flooded basement. What he did not have was a single completed project that anyone had agreed to fund. He had been sitting in the atrium of the CBC offices one February afternoon, waiting to be seen by a development executive who would later send a form rejection without his name spelled correctly. When the woman at the next chair leaned over and said quietly, "Your pitch document has a calculation error on page 7. He looked at her. She was holding a copy of the deck he had accidentally left face up on the chair beside him. She had dark hair and reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the specific composure of a woman who had learned to make herself heard in rooms that did not expect her to speak. "That's confidential," he said. She handed it back. "I know, the error is still there." Her name was Sylvie Langlois. She was a financial analyst doing contract work for a media fund. She had no reason to spend another minute talking to him. She spent the next 2 hours in that atrium going through his numbers line by line, while outside the February wind moved down Frontenac Street. And somewhere upstairs a man was deciding his project wasn't fundable. "You're projecting a 22% return in the first cycle," she said. "But your cost model assumes post-production prices from 4 years ago. The margin doesn't exist." Ronan looked at the page. He had been staring at this document for 3 weeks and had not seen it. She tapped the column with the end of her pen. "You need to rebuild from here. And your revenue assumptions are optimistic for a first production. Conservative investors don't want optimism. They want to see that you've already accounted for the worst version." He looked at her. "Why are you telling me this?" She considered the question briefly. "Because it's fixable, and you're about to go in there and hand them something broken." He did not get the meeting that afternoon. The executive had left early, but Ronan came back to the CBC atrium 3 days later with a revised deck and a coffee for the chair where Sylvie had been sitting, on the chance she might be there again. She was. She looked at the coffee. She looked at the revised document he held out to her. Then she sat down and opened it. "Better," she said after a few minutes. She pointed to the too confident here. "They'll read this as naive." He pulled out a pen. "Show me." She did. He came back the following week and the week after that. He told himself it was about the pitch. He was not entirely lying. 6 weeks later, when he finally asked Sylvie Langlois to dinner, she said yes without hesitation, as if she had been waiting for him to stop pretending it was only about the numbers. Over dinner she told him she had her own ambitions. A financial modeling consultancy she had been building in the margins of her contract work. Small and disciplined and precise. She had 3 clients. She was working toward 10. He told her about the documentary series he wanted to make about the manufacturing towns along the St. Lawrence that everyone had stopped paying attention to. She listened with the kind of attention that felt like being taken seriously, rather than tolerated. By the end of the evening he understood something that would take him another decade to fully lose sight of. Sylvie Langlois was not a woman who would ever need someone to carry her. She was a woman who showed up with the tools already in her hands. He fell in love with exactly that. They built the first years together in the way people do when they have more ambition than furniture. Sylvie kept her consulting work. Ronan poured everything into his productions. In the evenings they sat on opposite sides of the kitchen table, with their respective files spread out between them. She would look up from her work and say something that reframed his, and he would do the same for her, and in this way they were genuinely collaborative, genuinely useful to each other. He remembered the evening before his first real pitch to a major broadcaster. He had been sitting at the kitchen table going over his notes at 11 at night, exhausted and cycling through the same paragraph without absorbing it. Sylvie had taken the pages from him without asking, read them through twice, and then said, "You're starting with the production history. Start with the people. The investors you're meeting tomorrow grew up in towns like these, make them feel it before they calculate it." He had looked at her, then he had rewritten the opening. The pitch worked. The broadcaster said yes. He called it instinct in the debrief. His instinct, he believed it was true. He did not stop to think about whose voice had shaped the opening paragraph. In the years that followed, Whitfield Productions grew in the way that creative companies sometimes grow. When the person running them is both talented and relentless. Projects accumulated. The reputation built. There were award nominations and industry panels and profiles in publications that described Ronan Whitfield as a singular voice in Canadian documentary filmmaking. In nearly all of them Sylvie was mentioned once, in a subordinate clause. Usually something like he credits his wife's support during the early years. Sylvie never said anything about it. She had learned by then that saying something created a particular expression on Ronan's face, patient and slightly absent, the expression of a man who had already moved on to the next thing. The changes came slowly enough that he could always explain each one away individually. He stopped asking her to read his pitches. He had a development team now. He had people for that. He stopped asking about her consulting work, not deliberately. There was always something more pressing. An edit that needed to be reviewed, a call with a broadcaster, a festival submission. He would pour 2 glasses of wine in the evening and she would begin to tell him about a project and he would nod, and later he would realize he had not absorbed a single word. Once she stopped mid-sentence and said, simply, "You're not listening." He had looked up. He had apologized. He had meant it, but he had not changed. At an industry gala 3 years into Whitfield Productions' real ascent, Ronan stood near the bar surrounded by broadcasters, distributors, and a journalist from a national magazine who was writing a profile about independent Canadian producers. Sylvie stood beside him in a gray dress that suited her and was largely invisible to everyone in the room. A woman from a broadcaster asked Ronan about a risk he had taken on an unconventional financing structure for his last series. Ronan explained it. Sylvie, standing to his left, said quietly, "The approach came out of a model we worked on together a few years ago. It's not typical for production financing, but it reduces the exposure on the back end considerably." The journalist turned to her. That's interesting. Can you explain how? Ronan laughed, the comfortable laugh of a man accustomed to the center of a room. She keeps the technical side of things running, he said easily. I handle the creative chaos. The journalist smiled and looked back at Ronan. Sylvie picked up her wine glass. She did not look at her husband, but her fingers around the stem were very still. An older producer named Gordon Fairfax, who had been standing slightly apart from the group, caught her eye. He had heard her answer. He had also heard how it was handled. After the gala in the car home, Sylvie sat beside Ronan and looked out the window at the lights along René Levesque. He was talking about the journalist's interest in his next project. Sylvie said nothing. He did not notice. She had been noticing a great deal by then. She had started keeping things to herself the way you store things when you no longer trust the space around you. Small things at first. A client meeting she didn't mention. A contract she signed without discussing. A Friday afternoon she spent at her office instead of coming home at noon as she usually did. Ronan had not noticed any of these absences. He was not the kind of man who tracked what was missing. He was the kind of man who noticed what was in front of him. And what was in front of him was always the work. She had opened a separate business account 18 months before the afternoon he came home early in March. Not from anger. She would remember this later. Clearly, it had not been anger. It had been the cold, practical recognition that she was going to need her own ground to stand on, because the ground they shared had been quietly redefined without her consent. Her consultancy had grown. It had grown significantly. The 3 clients she'd had when she and Ronan met had become 11, then 20, then a roster of mid-market companies and investment funds, who called her before they called their own lawyers. She had 2 full-time staff. She had been offered a partnership in a Bay Street firm and declined it because she preferred to run her own operation. Ronan knew she worked. He described her work at parties as her little consultancy. He said it warmly. He did not understand that it was no longer little, because he had never asked. She had tried to tell him once 14 months ago over dinner. She had said, "We had a significant year. I want to show you the numbers." He had said, "That's great, Sylv." And then his phone had lit up with a message from his director of photography, and he had picked it up and read it at the table, and by the time he set it down the subject had dissolved. She had not tried again after that. When Ronan came home early on that Thursday in March, Sylvie had not been expecting him until 7. She had made a mistake she would not have made if she had been careful. She had not been careful. She was tired of being careful. And the woman she was with had been in her life for 8 months. And the effort of keeping her invisible had become its own kind of grief. What Ronan did not know, walking out of his house with a gray duffel bag and 12 years of assumptions, was that Sylvie had not been the only one keeping secrets. He found out 6 days later. He had been staying in a suite at a hotel on McGill College, the kind of hotel that was anonymous and expensive, and suited to a man who needed to think without interruption. He had called his sister Petra the first night. He had called his lawyer the second. On the 6th day, Gordon Fairfax called him. "Ronan," Gordon said, "I'm going to say something and I need you to hear it properly." Ronan sat down. "Do you know what Sylvie has been working on?" Gordon asked. He said her consultancy. Gordon was quiet for a moment. "Her firm," he said. "Langlaw Risk Advisory." He paused. "You should look it up." Ronan looked it up. He sat in the hotel suite for a long time with his laptop open on the desk, and the morning light coming through the east-facing window, and the coffee getting cold beside him, and he read. Langlaw Risk Advisory had been incorporated 4 years ago. It had a website that was precise and unadorned, the kind of website that did not need to advertise because the work advertised for itself. The client list was not public, but the case studies were, and the case studies described work he recognized, not because he had been involved, because he had heard of the companies, the industries, the deals. Some of them he had used as reference points in his own financing conversation, without knowing the underlying risk architecture had been built by his wife. There was a profile of Sylvie on the site. Recent, professional. She was described as one of the most trusted independent risk analysts working in Canadian commercial finance. The quotes from clients used words like essential and irreplaceable, and "she sees what other people miss." Ronan stared at the last one for a long time. "She sees what other people miss." He thought about the CBC atrium. The error on page 7, the opening paragraph of his first major pitch, the financing structure that had made his most successful series possible. The evening she had handed him a restructured approach to a failing budget negotiation, and he had used it in a meeting the next morning, and come home saying he'd found a way through. He had found a way through. His throat tightened. He called his brother-in-law, who knew people in the finance sector. "Yes," he said when Ronan asked. "I've known about Sylvie's firm for a couple of years. I assumed you knew." Ronan set the phone down carefully. He thought about every dinner party where he had steered the conversation away from her when it moved toward her work. Not deliberately, not cruelly, just in the automatic way of a man who has decided, without examining the decision, that the most interesting person in the room is himself. He thought about Gordon Fairfax at the gala watching. He thought about the way Sylvie's hand had gone very still around her wine glass. He thought about the morning she had said, We had a significant year. I want to show you the numbers. And he had picked up his phone. He did not sleep that night. He drove to Langlois Risk Advisory's office on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after the Thursday in March. The building was on de Maisonneuve, glass and clean lines, the kind of address that said the person inside did not need to impress anyone. He had not called ahead. He was not sure she would have agreed to see him if he had. The receptionist recognized his name. "One moment," she said. Her voice was careful. He waited in a chair near a window that looked out on a street still carrying the last gray traces of winter. Through the glass panels that bordered the offices, he could see people moving with specific purpose, heads down over documents, a whiteboard covered in diagrams, a meeting in a far corner room where Sylvie stood at the head of the table. He watched her. She was speaking and the 3 people seated around the table were writing things down, not politely, with intention. He had sat beside this woman at 100 industry dinners. He had watched people ask her questions and watched himself redirect the conversation, without understanding what he was redirecting away from. The door to the conference room opened. Sylvie walked out. She saw him through the glass. She stopped for just a moment. Then she said something to a colleague and came toward the reception area. She looked the same. She looked completely different. He understood that both things were true and that the difference was in him. "Ronan," she said. He stood. "I'm sorry to come without warning." She studied him. Her expression was not cold, but it was not open either. It was the expression of a woman who had stopped leaving doors unlocked. "Do you have a few minutes?" he asked. She looked at her watch. "A few." She led him into a small meeting room off the reception area. Not her office, he noticed. It was a room for conversations you could end. They sat down across from each other. Ronan said, "I found Langlois Risk Advisory." She said nothing. "I've been reading." He looked at the table. "I've been trying to understand why I didn't know." "That's a question you can answer yourself," Sylvie said. Gently. Not harshly, just precisely. He looked up. "I know." He paused. "I told myself I was supportive because I didn't stand in the way of your work. I brought you to events. I mentioned that you had a consultancy." Her expression did not change. "I didn't ask," he said. "I didn't ask what you were building, what you needed, how it was going. I didn't ask because I had already decided the shape of our life and where you fit in it, and asking would have required me to look at something I wasn't ready to see." Sylvie was quiet. He continued. "I took credit for ideas that came from you. Not always deliberately. But I used your thinking and called it instinct, and I never once stopped to correct that in front of other people. I let them call me visionary for structures you built." He stopped. "And I brought the whole world of recognition I had earned, which was partly earned on the back of your work, back to dinner and handed you a glass of wine, and didn't notice that you had stopped drinking it." Sylvie looked at the window. Outside, the city moved in its ordinary way. "How long have you known about her?" Ronan asked. The woman he meant was the one who had been in the hallway in March. He had not spoken her name. He found he could not quite do it yet. "Over a year," Sylvie said. He absorbed this. "Why didn't you say anything?" She turned back to him. "Because by the time I found out, I had already made my peace with the fact that the marriage I thought we had wasn't the one we were actually living in." She said it without bitterness. That was the hardest part. It was not a speech prepared to wound him. It was simply true. She knew how to use exact language. She always had. Ronan felt somewhere specific. "I'm sorry," he said. He said it clearly, without hedging. Not I'm sorry but, just, sorry." "I know," she said. "Is there anything?" he started. She shook her head, not quickly, not dramatically. Just a steady, considered movement that meant she had already lived through the version of the question he was about to ask. "I don't want you to be sorry, Ronan," she said. "I want you to understand. And I think you're getting there." She paused. "But understanding doesn't require me to be here for it." He looked at her. She was not unkind. She was finished, and there was a difference. He said, "You built something extraordinary." She looked at him directly. "I built what I've always been capable of building." She held his gaze. "You just never looked." He did not answer because there was no answers that did not confirm it. Sylvie stood. She straightened the folder in front of her, a small practical gesture, and she was already partway back to the thing that was hers, the thing that had been hers all along, before he had even arrived in that waiting room chair. "I hope the next series is everything you want it to be," she said. She meant it. That was one of the things he had never adequately valued, the way she could wish him well without reservation even when she was done with him. She walked toward the door. Ronan stayed where he was. "Sylvie," he said. She turned. "The firm," he said. "The profile on the website. It says you see what other people miss." He stopped. "I just want you to know that I know how early that was true, and I know what I cost us by not saying." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once and left the room. Ronan sat alone at the small table. Outside the glass, Langlois Risk Advisory continued its day. Screens and documents and people who had found Sylvie Whitfield, Sylvie Langlois, before he had thought to look, and had known exactly what they were getting. He left the building and walked out into the March air. The winter was loosening, tentatively. On Stay Catherine, people moved with the particular energy of a city that had survived another season and was quietly deciding what came next. Ronan walked for a long time. He had arrived in marriage believing that love was the most reliable thing he possessed. He had confused reliability with invisibility, presence with permanence, and patience with permission. He had believed that Sylvie would be there because she had always been there, the way you believe in light switches and running water, without ever asking what keeps them working. He thought about the CBC atrium, page 7, the error she had found before he walked into a room that would shape the rest of his life. He thought about all the rooms after that, all the things she had found that he had walked away carrying. He had built a career, a reputation, a company. He had stood in rooms full of people who praised him and he had let them, and some of it was genuine, and some of it had been quietly assembled by the woman who had driven home beside him in silence on the way back from a gala on René Lévesque. He understood now. Not the understanding that asks for something in return, just the kind that arrives too late to be anything other than itself, clear and heavy and permanent. Sylvie had not become someone remarkable the day she stopped waiting for him to see it. She had been remarkable the afternoon he sat down across from her, with a broken pitch deck, and she had handed him back a way forward. He had just never looked up long enough to understand the direction she was pointing. The months that followed were quieter than he had expected. Not empty, just different in the way that real things are different from the stories people tell about them. Ronan gave an interview, 6 months later, to a magazine doing a piece on independent production in Canada. The journalist asked about the financing model that had made his Third Seat series possible. The one everyone cited, the one that had become something of a reference point in the industry. He said the core of that model was built by a financial analyst I was close to during that period. Her name is Sylvie Langlois. She runs Langlois Risk Advisory. If you want to understand how it actually works, she's the one to call. The journalist looked surprised. That's not what the earlier profile said. I know, Ronan said, the earlier profile was wrong. He did not make it a performance. He did not say it to be praised for saying it. He said it because it was accurate, and accuracy was the least he could offer now. Across the city, Sylvie was in a meeting with a new client, a manufacturing company reconsidering its exposure on a long-term supply contract. She was drawing a diagram on a whiteboard, patient and precise, her handwriting exact and legible, in the way of someone who has long understood that clarity is its own form of authority. She did not know about the interview. She would find out later from a colleague who had read it. She would feel something when she heard. Something that was not quite forgiveness and not quite closure, but was something gentler than either. She had not built her firm to make a point. She had built it because her mind required work the way a room requires air, and the room she had been standing in had not been large enough to breathe. Her name was on the door now. She had not waited for anyone to let her put it there. There is a particular kind of loss that does not arrive with noise. It arrives the way good work is recognized. Quietly after the fact, by people who finally understand what was in front of them all along. And sometimes the person who taught you to see it is already down the hall, at the head of their own table, not waiting for you to catch up.